Well, I know the speakers, so yeah, got it in.
Is this far recorded? Do you want it?
Yeah, if I just, like, if I stand here, I can see both this and that, and that's exactly what
You can keep an eye on the two of us.
We can do
Oh, I like that.
All right, leave it alone a minute. I'd like to talk with you and.
I'll keep your seat.
We're gonna say that.
Oh,
He is getting up there. The guy I know. I'm just trying to go this way.
really? Oh, yes. Can't believe it.
I could recommend his book.
When you're an addict, you
I
know.
really want to document his book. It's quite good. It's about.
Are we ready to-
adventures.
Yes, we're all set.
This identified.
Just a couple of announcements before we get started. I'm happy to say that as far as our trip to the, for the Auschwitz exhibit at the Reagan Presidential Library, there's a group called, MV Manhattan Beach Against, no, wait, it's MV United, and they're an anti-hate group locally. And they're going to be, some of the people from that group are going to be joining us. So thrilled for that. Hope that you will all join. I'll be taking sign-ups after this. And I was supposed to announce this last week and I forgot. Trinity Church, some too close church here. It's over like on 11th or 10th, something like that.
It's Lutheran?
Yes, it's Lutheran, Trinity Lutheran. They're having an event next week, next Sunday night at 6:30, February 26th. And it's for Black History Month. They're showing the recording of a video with James Baldwin and William Buckley debate that took place at Cambridge in 1965. I believe it had to do with racism, and it's going to be followed up by an open discussion. So hopefully it will probably be similar to what we do here, but I would like to invite you. I'm going to try and make it because it sounds interesting. I've never even heard of this format on it. Anyways, so next week, next Sunday at 6:30 p.m. And so today we got, like, we're so excited, or at least I'm so excited. We have Gary Hartzell. We haven't been able to hear from him for quite some time, and he's always such a hoot and just an enjoyable.
Is that a technical term?
Yeah. Midwest. But anyways, but we're thrilled to have him. So thanks for joining us and welcome, Gary. I think everybody knows his background. He's a former college professor, teacher, and you'll be able to tell by the way, whatever's the story. Thanks so much, Gary.
I know you mean that in the very best way.
I do.
All right. Let's get down to business. I don't exactly know how to introduce this. This is a, for lack of a better term, a shotgun. In that, I don't go in any particular order, but everything you'll see is connected to a single thing. And looking at you guys, I think you're all gonna, no offense, be old enough to tap into the central theme. So, there was we know all kinds of things about history and historical figures. The difficulty is, as Mark Twain said, well, it is not with what we know, it's what we know that isn't so. And so that's what we're going to take a look at. It may not happen this time. Now, I didn't make slides for it because I'd already spoken about it when I made a presentation on the personalities of the first Christmas. if you were there, may remember, and then when I did one about Pontius Pilate, Guy Hadley showed up in a toga.
Seemed like the thing to.
So anyway, I won't, but it's things like this. Ever since I was 5 years old, I can remember, that's as far back as I remember, I guess. Christmas came and I would hear the same words. When Quirinius was the governor of Syria. And when Rome, orders came out from Rome that there was to be a census taken, all that kind of stuff. Quirinius wasn't the governor of Syria at that time. He wouldn't be for almost 8 years later. He is an impressive man, though. Next time I'll try to tune in on him a little. He was Augustus Caesar's best friend, most trusted supporter, general of the army, and unlike many other Roman generals, he conquered a town in Galicia once, had 40,000 prisoners. Most Romans would have simply done the opposite. So he didn't. He moved them 500 miles and built a village and said, now here, farm and live, stay out of trouble. And he left. I mean, he's just absolutely a fascinating guy. But my point is, if you read the Bible, New Testament, he was not the governor of Syria for another probably 8 years. So let's take a look at this. For me, this all started in 1962. You remember the old Lamar Theater?
Wow.
Oh, yeah, that was, I fell in love in there several times. And it was beautiful, and then it closed in the middle 80s, and I have missed it ever since. But I went there in 1962, and I can remember sitting there with the mermaids on the walls and all of the things that were beautiful inside the Lamar, and watching this movie.
Yeah.
Hi, Rich. Rosie.
Sorry, I've got my coffee.
I'm not sure I want you to be signing.
Well, just be careful, I've got a lot of
Anyway, it's a 1962 movie. It's not a wonderful movie, but it is intriguing. James Stewart, John Wayne, Woody Strode. You remember Woody Strode? The big black guy, played football in college and then went on to be an actor. He's the gladiator that was killed. Spartacus. He was a marvelous actor. And then down the right, you can see Lee Marvin. He is playing Liberty Valance, who is a killer and a bully. So there's immediate conflict with James Do-Gooder Stewart's. And the conflict goes back and forth. And the long and short of it is that Liberty Valance gets shot dead one night on the street. And the thought was that it was James Stewart's character that did it. The truth is, it was John Wayne's character from an alley with a rifle. Started to sound like a but the story developed continually. That mild mannered young attorney trying to build himself a life in the West had shot Liberty Valance, and he became a hero, a person of legend. But he kept trying to tell people that he was doing, and they would not believe it. And so the end of the movie is James Stewart's character. He's been elected to the Senate. I hope for a better future for him, but he has been elected to the Senate, and a newspaper editor was interviewed and asking him finally about a man who shot Liberty Valance. And Stewart once again said, I am not the man who shot Liberty Valance. And the editors turn to him and says, sir, where am I going here? Oh, wrong one, there. Sir, when this is the West, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend. So that's what they did, and now that's what we're gonna have from here on, is printing the legend. Again, that's the only binding theme in this. Everything else just as it came to me. When I was growing up here, and if you grew up here, you might have watched on KTLA in the late afternoons, Colonel Tim McCoy. He was an actual Army colonel, had been in actually Old West cavalry for a little while. He was very popular. He made a lot of movies in the 30s. And he had a local program here, 6 days a week, with only 15 minutes long. There were a good number of 15-minute programs in the late 40s and early 50s. And he was on there 6 days a week, and he would tell Native stories. He would talk about Native American customs and the differences between tribes. I mean, it was really good stuff. If he could capture me at 7, you know, he was, who was it? Isaac Asimov, maybe. If you can't explain something to a 6-year-old, you really don't understand. Anyway, he was on there and he had Iron Eyes Cody with him. You remember Iron Eyes Cody? Yeah, and they would sign off with that with wash stick. The Coda language word, it's done and it's good. Wash stick. Wash stick. No. It was a good enough program that it won lots of local Emmys, and they both ended up, because they had both been in movies and in television, they ended up with
What was that?
It's Iron Eyes. It had been their, they gotten stars on Hollywood Boulevard. It was just wonderful. And then later, in the 70s, 1971 exactly, the first environmental campaign began. And what better face for it than an American Native? I mean, it was just absolutely wonderful. And as you see, it says the most famous tier, because it's, you know, dripping down and our wildness is being lost.
For any who don't remember, that he's paddling a canoe through a polluted river,
Right.
and all this floating garbage floating around, and
Yeah.
that's the premise of the scene here.
It's wonderful, and I remember it was a movie. The problem is, he's not anything. No, I mean, it's got that, it was his face, but his name is Espera Oscar de Corti. His family moved to Louisiana in the 1890s, and he was born in Louisiana in 1904. Went on to an acting career, movie career, became the face of the environmental movement and the face of the Native American movement, and he went either one. And it's just, I think it's just great, marvelous. I don't know if they could have found a Native American alive who had a better face for that. So then also out of my childhood, maybe out of yours, is the Cisco Kid on the left and his faithful companion Pancho on the right. This was a start, a beginning, a landmark in Hollywood. The Cisco Kid was on TV from 1950 to 1956. The Cisco Kid was based on some old Henry stories, the Caballero's Way, and sort of a Robin Hood of the Old West. And it was on radio from 1942 to 1945, and then on television from 50 to 56. It was the first TV show in color. And it was supposedly the first Hispanic led show on television. Carrillo was Mexican / Spanish. Duncan Ronaldo was a Romanian. Who had his family come to the US in the 1920s.
Pancho's favorite saying with his little kid.
That's when.
And Cisco, let me say, Cisco, the sheriff, he's getting closer. Okay.
He played this, well, this was something that
It always
they
had the same
wanted.
ending. It always had the same ending. This was my show. And I always played Cisco. And my sister was because.
Anyway.
I'm younger, so I remember Cisco Kid as a song by the group before.
Anyway, Rio is the real thing, and I mean his family and he, the real thing. And he played this buffoon, but he wasn't. He was anything but, and he was true Californian with really deep roots. In 1769, his great grandfather came with the Gaspar de Portola Spanish expedition that was escorting Father Junipero Serra, who came to San Diego and founded the first of the California missions. So his family was in on California early on. Father Serra, the next year at 70, married his great grandfather. So here's, probably the most famous clergyman in California, and he was married by them. When you go down over the next few generations, his great grandfather in the 1830s was the Mexican governor of California. And then his grandfather's brother, his uncle, was the mayor of Los Angeles City for 3 terms.
Really?
Yeah. And later on, when this was all finished, Carrillo went back to his, there are some old movies you get where he plays the romantic lead. I mean, he is not at all macho. So much more. And he got involved with the a planning commission, probably now the commissions. And he was instrumental in getting the Hearst Castle into California hands. Government taking it over and making it open to the public. Yeah.
Is there a Leo Carrillo Beach? And is
Yes.
that
Yeah.
related to him?
Near Malibu.
Related to him at all?
That's him. His name is Morgan.
Leo.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it's Carrillo.
Carrillo.
He's Castilian, family's Castilian. So from anywhere else in Spain or Mexico, you pronounce 2 L's like a Y. The Castilians pronounce it with the L's, so it's Carrillo. Yeah.
Is this the same way that Korea used to go out and do lassoing and stuff?
Yeah.
Rules and all that?
Yeah.
Treated my elementary school on the 4th grade.
Okay, that's all we need. We have a link. My parents took me when I was about 6 or 7 over to what used to be Sears and Roebuck in Santa Monica, right off the freeway there. And these 2 guys were up on the roof, and so we went up there and they put on a little show, and it was marvelous. I just okay, so now let's take a look at some other sets. We're dealing with Westerners, and that was a Western movie that said, "Print the legend." Here's a legend. This guy is not what you think and not what you ever thought. That is a tough man. that is a killer. He had to be cleaned up a lot for television and movies. Yeah, I forgot to put Douglas, what's his first name? Kurt. No, not Kurt. Russell, Kurt Russell, there, I got it in there, but this is not what Wyatt Earp looked like at all. And the butt line, complete man. If Earp did use a gun like that, his purpose would have been to knock you over the head. His major approach to people who were not cooperative was called buffaloing. And you pull out a pistol, and maybe that one, and hit him over the head. And then there's no gunfight. I mean, he avoided killing people for a long time because he just, you know. The movies and television downplayed his relationship with his brothers. His brothers are really interesting people, particularly if you get a chance. And I have a book I'd be glad to loan to somebody. It's a biography of his older brother, Virgil. And Virgil was the real thing. That was somebody who didn't mess around with it all. And he was telling me a sad story. They were living in Iowa, Pella, Iowa, and the Civil War started. And most of your brothers, all except Virgil, were too old to go to service. But Virgil had fallen in love with a girl at a competing church down the road. Her family did not approve of the Earp family and their version of religion. And Virgil's father did not approve of the girl or her religion. So they were thinking that they were going to have to elope, and they got all set to do it when Virgil got called up for service, and he was off to fight. Parents took advantage of that, and while he was gone in the Civil War, they told the girl that he had been killed in battle. And that that was the end of it. Except he had. But she believed it. So she married another very nice man, and they moved to Oregon. We'll come back to that in a minute. Moved to Oregon. And eventually, when the war ended, Virgil came back. And where is she? And she's gone. And they tell him that they first tried to tell him that she died. Show me where. So it was his loss. It hurt him for the rest of his life. It was memories he never could have had. Ignored his relationship. We're back to Wyatt now. We'll come back to, well, I'll tell you now. We'll come back to Virgil in a minute. After the great gunfight at the OK Corral in October of 1881, the gunfight was such an event that it made the national news and went out over the telegraphs all over the country. One place of which was Oregon. And the woman who'd gotten away read the article, and she sent a telegram to Tombstone to Virgil Earp saying, if you are the Virgil Earp I knew in Iowa, I have somebody I'd like you to meet, and that we need to get together. So apparently they had consummated their marriage before their marriage, and she went out to Oregon with a baby. And he was stunned, absolutely stunned. And he went out and met her and did what he could. But it was a sad, sad story. Wyatt Earp has been portrayed by more actors on movies and television than any president has been portrayed. Shows you the potency, the power of the legend. He was a disgusting person in a lot of ways. He was a buffalo hunter for a while. That's just slaughter all day, all day, all day. He worked just as a common laborer, carrying construction to building sites. Then he got a job in Illinois. And he worked on a river called Bordello, out in the middle, right off of Peoria. And he was out there and he was the bouncer on the boat, he throw you overboard. And eventually Peoria said that the herbs are not welcome within the city limits ever again. So he took off, and then in 1874, he went to Kansas. When he went to Kansas, he began then to get in law enforcement. And his reputation was scary, and it was sound. He did what it said he did, but people didn't like him at all. He brought a girl with him, Maddie Blaylock. He'd known her in Iowa. She had ended up, by the time he found her, as a prostitute. And she went with Dodge City to him in 1876, and they were living together in Dodge City while he was law enforcement and she was working in the brothel. And that's one of the things about her brothers. Every one of them had an association with a brothel. His brother Warren went to Kansas, Wichita, and then Dodge City. And he had a hotel with breakfast downstairs, beds upstairs, occupied. And he first B&B. She was addicted to laudanum, and it did not, as you can imagine, end well. He abandoned her for somebody else.
Was laudanum an opiate?
Yeah, right. Painkiller, opiate. Dentist prescribed, although you didn't need a prescription, you could just walk in and buy it. In Tombstone, he met Josephine Sarah Marcus. Fell in love, left the woman he'd been living with right away, began an affair with her. She was a daredevil. Her family was very rich in San Francisco, owned a big baking concern. And she had a ton of money, but she wanted adventure, saw herself as an actress. She joined a theatrical company and they toured the West. And they went to Dodge City, where that was the first time he saw her. And then down to Tombstone they came, and there he was again. So they began this great affair. By the turn of the century, this is what she looked like: money, society, status. She was born in New York in 1860 to Hyman and Sophia Marcus.
Is that Neiman Marcus something?
I don't know that. Find that out. Whole choice for parents to go to San Francisco, but they hit it big. Just like the Earps were trying to hit it big in Tombstone. They had done law work around the West. They had also run bordellos and saloons, and they had been card sharps, and they had been thrown out of one town after another. But the brotherhood among them was so close that when Virgil said, I am going to go to, I got the right button. I don't have the right button. Oh.
Don't cry.
No. It was not the top, but I know, I was trying to get the, I was trying to get the laser.
You're gonna hold it. Hold the laser button. Like hold it down.
This one,
Invisible.
what do I have to do it on here?
No, I think it's just too light, right on.
Should we turn off the light?
This is not.
Nah, it's not worth it. Thank you. Well, all right, maybe it is. No, it's, we won't bother with it. Time is fleeting. And this is Virgil Earp. And we got floating meeting control. And this is not a brother, this is Wyatt. This is Doc Holliday, who's very, very famous. There are wonderful myths about him too, which we'll get to in just a moment. Anyway, they got into mining interests, cattle thievery. They went down to Mexico and they stole cattle and brought it back. Stole it. Tombstone was a booming mining town. They needed food. And so a lot of people were involved in getting it to them one way or another. Now this isn't working out, what is it? You know, where is that 12-year-old? There we go. And then it was night. Now, the capstone of everything came in October of 1881. The famous gunfight at the Gokay Corral. This only lasted about 30 seconds, but there were more than 30 shots fired. And it was not nearly as clean as you see because they were all armed with black powder pistols. And after about the first 3 or 4 shots, they couldn't see each other. They went on shooting. And the cowboys, as they were called, were killed, but Virgil Earp was hit, Morgan Earp was hit, and a bullet bounced off Holliday's holster and knocked him down, but he wasn't hurt. Holiday is as cool a customer as you can imagine. My grandmother, my mother's mother, was a good lass from Ireland. And she would look at the movies and such, and Doc Holliday, and she would say, oh, that's the way about it. And she just loved it. Later on, she would say the same thing about Chuck Connery. In the aftermath, his wife, well, they never were married. Actually, none of the Earp brothers were ever officially married.
Good players.
His common law wife wrote a book called I Married Wyatt Earp, where she told the story of Wyatt Earp as she wished it had been. And then with enough money, because her family was wealthy, she hired a hack writer, Stuart Blake, who in the 20s wrote a book called Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal, and that's the beginning of it all.
Have you read either one of those books?
I read, I was, like 10 when I read Wyatt Earp, Frontier Marshal. I've never read her book. But this became the legend. So when the legend becomes fact, we're the legend. And so this is what created the image of Wyatt Earp that we are familiar with today. And most of it's simply not true. She married it, and then to get a little publicity, she had some pictures taken and claimed that that was her. It turns out after investigation that that was a model in New York during World War I. but Sarah Marcus decided that it looked, there's enough, maybe she can get away with it. So this becomes the frontispiece inside of it. And so, just all lies, wonderful lies. When it all ended, it went to Hollywood land before the earthquake that knocked down land. And he got into the movie business, hired as a consultant on the Real West. He made it up as he went. And he had great friends in movie making. William S. Hart, one of the first movie cowboys, and Tom Mix, still around when I was a kid. He lasted there making movies until he died in January of 1929. So here's somebody who outlived the whole of the Old West, came out of it with a sparkling legend and a fortune. And it was all a fraud. And Sarah Marcus lived till 1944, spinning news stories about Wyatt Earp. Now, if you've seen Wyatt Earp, Kevin Costner's version, or Tombstone with Kurt Russell and Val Kilmer, then you obviously have to know, well, no. No. All right, I'll tell you about the holiday letter. I'm sorry.
Awaken or the bad Julius stays.
Probably the best known Roman, maybe Pontius Pilate's name is a little more familiar with the world around him and the spread of Christianity. But you think of Rome, you think of Julius Caesar. Caesar was a force, he was a power, he was a very, very bright man. He was a genius as a general, and he shaped and used the Roman army, perhaps the most famous one. There's some thought that he looked kind of like this. And he had an elongated skull. There's no sure about that. I rather like the statues. Now there's two legends connected with him that we all know. One is that he was born by cesarean section. That's not true. He had a normal birth. When he became the dictator of Rome and Rome's population was falling, he issued an edict that any woman who was in labor and it appeared she was likely to die, they were to cut the child out and save that. So it's called cesarean section because he ordered it, not because he experienced it. So it's it's one of those deals where if it didn't happen that way, it should. Uneventful birth. Then the other, at the end of the tale, is March 15th, 44 BC, and his assassination. It was a terrible thing. It was planned. He was not going to go to the Senate that day, and then he was talked into it by somebody I'll show in a moment. And Shakespeare tells us that his last word, he was stabbed 23 times. Probably half of them fatal.
How do we know that?
They did an autopsy.
Who's that?
Some medical establishment from. And so,
Okay.
and Shakespeare tells us that his last word were "et tu, Brute." Well, probably not. Words pretty much were more likely Greek. He spoke several languages fluently, and it would have been the story that Shakespeare gives us, you know Shakespeare, who are the two leading conspirators to assassinate Caesar?
Mark Antony.
Mark Antony. And who is the man of the lean and hungry look? Cassius. They were involved. They did participate. But they weren't the very leader. It's a man lost to history because Shakespeare didn't find it convenient to write him into his play. So Brutus and Cassius come out as the lead villains in life. And behind the scenes was Decimus. Decimus is the bastard. Decimus, yeah. He had his own coins for a short while and medals and such. He was a magnificent soldier, but he was the forgotten and the most important assassin. He doesn't look like a guy to mess with. Decimus Junius Brutus Albinus, he was a cousin of Brutus.
Does the word decimate?
I have to look that up. I don't think so. To decimate was to kill 1 in 10.
Okay.
Decimus was more of killed 9 out of 10. He had spent a lot of time with Caesar in the army, in Caesar's campaigns. He is given credit for conquering Gaul, conquering France, and bringing it into the Roman Empire. Caesar then made him the governor of Gaul. Powerful point. He had another round of military threat. He became an admiral and he beat the Gauls in a naval battle off of Marseille. This is a very, very capable soldier and always loyal to Caesar. As a soldier and an admiral, he had insight into Caesar's thinking and how all these pieces would fit together to create the empire. And he rose quickly. But same thing that happened with Benedict Arnold. You know the main reason why Benedict Arnold turned traitor? He felt he wasn't valued enough. Other lesser generals got promotions and he didn't. And eventually it turned him sour and he betrayed the country. Caesar, who loved attention and the great triumph, which was a parade through all of Rome, with the whole army and whatever prisoners they had, goods, booty they had taken. It was the triumph, which is what it was called, and it was that to honor the conquering general. Decimus was convinced he had earned a triumph, and Caesar wouldn't let him have it. Caesar wanted only Caesar triumphs. So Decimus turned negative. The night before the assassination, Caesar was at a dinner party with Decimus. And he was saying he wasn't feeling all that good. He said, you know, I'm not going to go to the Senate tomorrow. I'm just going to stay home. And Decimus went to work on him about, you need to be in the Senate. There are big things coming with our country and the empire and all. Decimus talked him into going into the Senate the next day. Otherwise, the assassination probably would have been another time. He convinced Caesar to attend, and then they killed him. And when it was over, Decimus, who had a battalion of gladiators that he used as his own bodyguard and a private army, then swept up Cassius and Brutus and a number of others, conspirators, got them out of Rome, got them to a place where they were protected, had his army of gladiators protect them, and eventually have a chance for them to get out of Italy. Still loyal to the empire, if not to Caesar, Decimus hated Caesar's adopted son, he was really a nephew that Roman law would allow you to call him your son if you adopted him. This is the man who will become Augustus, the most famous of the Caesars. Decimus got into an alliance with Octavian, and they worked together for a while to control Rome. But then Octavian, Augustus's ambitions overwhelmed him, and he decided to get rid of the people who had been involved in the assassination and the people who might be rivals for the emperorship. And so he sent Decimus with the army to the north, fight the German tribes, and he also arranged that in the midst of the battle against the Germans, somebody was going to kill Decimus. And so he was. So it's a sad story, but it just fascinates me how the way somebody writes something changes our entire perception of it. I mean, I remember reading Julius Caesar at school, and oh, geez, Brutus, Cassius, and I never heard of this. Actually, Shakespeare did put Decimus' name in once, but he misspelled it. And so when it was over, it was done and it didn't get into the play. And most of the world's knowledge about Julius Caesar comes from Shakespeare's play. Now, right in there with it is, of course, the famous Cleopatra. She was Cleopatra the seventh. The fun thing is that the stories about her mostly are not true, but some of them are, and that's interesting. The first story is that she was just absolutely beautiful. Well, take a look at that coin. That's not Elizabeth Taylor or any of that. The actresses who played her look a whole lot better than she did, but she was brilliant. She spoke a half dozen languages. She was well read in philosophy, and she wrote philosophy and history herself. She was a magnificent conversationalist. And she just was so attractive that most powerful people, men in the world, were drawn to her. And she made the most of it because she knows that she needs Rome's support to keep control of Egypt. So she is going to seduce Caesar. And she does that. You see the stylized statues that were made of her, one as an Egyptian in the center, and then the two that were one was Greek and one was Roman. She didn't look like that. And the thing that's interesting about her is that she's not an Egyptian. She's the most famous Egyptian queen. She's not Egyptian. She's Greek, with a lot of mixture down through the centuries. Her beginning ancestor was Ptolemy Lagus. Ptolemy was one of Alexander the Great's bodyguards, one of the elite seven, went everywhere with him. He was even his bodyguard when Philip II, Alexander's father, sent Alexander to study with Aristotle, and he went and as a bodyguard. But of course, he learned everything that Aristotle taught to Alexander, and he had this classical, wonderful education himself. When Alexander came to die in Babylon in 323 BC, Ptolemy realized the empire was going to fall apart. Nobody could hold it like Alexander had. And he knew that the breadbasket of the entire Mediterranean was Egypt. And so he decided to seize Egypt before anybody else could do it. They had talked about, he was the son of a minor noble, I tell you this. I'm sorry, I messed it up. But what he did, it was shows the audacity of the man.
What?
That when Caesar died, there was talk about having this funeral train that would carry him all the way back to Macedonia and bury him there. It started out, Ptolemy stopped it, had an army, captured it. He looked inside and Caesar's body, Alexander's body was dead, it was deteriorating. So he filled the thing with honey, which doesn't deteriorate. Honey, Roman honey is still good to eat today. And so is Greek and Egyptian. So he put it in a vat of honey and he went to Egypt and showed that he had brought Alexander. The Egyptians accepted it because they'd been under the rule of the Persians for 200 years and they just hated the Persians. So they took in Alexander and his bodyguard Ptolemy, and Ptolemy becomes the first of the Ptolemaic pharaohs. He is I already told you, I'm sorry it takes so long. One of the things he did was once he got settled in Alexandria, a city that, by the way, is named Alexandria because Alexander built it to his own specifications. In fact, around the edge of the Mediterranean, there are 23 cities named Alexandria. Alexander got around, did not want to be forgotten. This is the key. This is the shining crown, though. In Alexandria, Ptolemy decided to act on the education he had from Aristotle. And so he built the Library of Alexandria. I've talked to you about that before. His goal was to gain all the knowledge in the world and have it located right there. So that scholars, scientists, researchers, and all can come there and draw on the accumulated knowledge and wisdom of the ages. It's a beautiful, beautiful place. And they went to collect one of every book, which was a scroll, written in the world. And they put them there. They bought a lot of them. They scammed some. Athens had original Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides plays. And Ptolemy said, well, loan them to me, and I'll copy them and then get yours back to you. He loaned, copied him, and sent the copies back, along with a ton of gold. So they left it alone. And then, of course, every place they conquered, there was a library. So they just brought it home with them. The important man there for our purposes is Eratosthenes of Cyrene. Eratosthenes was the great polymath. He has a fun nickname. He's known as Beta. His knowledge and experience was not the greatest in the world in any subject, but he was the second greatest in the world. And if number one wasn't there, this was who you went to talk to. Eratosthenes is no slouch, as my father used to say. He wrote a star catalog, stood out who knows how many nights, and wrote a star catalog where the locations had half of 675 stars. He wrote 12 books on Greek comedy. He wrote a history of Troy. He wrote a history of the Olympics. He wrote multiple poetry books. I mean, the guy is just everything you want, but his greatest work is this. Eratosthenes, the polymath, figured out the circumference of the earth. And we're talking 300 BC.
Wow.
And he got within a close range. Maybe he was 2,000-3,000 miles off, but that's all.
That's great.
He did it with a stick and a shadow, which just fascinates me. He, I have to ask you to excuse me. I'm dealing with the aftermath of the surgery, and my doctor believes in better living through chemistry. So I take what he tells me and let settle. What he did was he was in Alexandria, and he stuck a stick in the ground, and he saw that a shadow went off to the side. And then down here at what became Aswan, there was a well that was famous throughout the Egyptian world that when it was noon on the summer solstice, it would shine directly down into that well, and there would be no shadow. So if you get this degree of a shadow at Alexandria, and at the same time you get no shadow in Aswan, that means it has to be curved.
Yeah.
And he figured that out. And then I can't remember how many stadia it was. Greeks and Romans love stadiums. And so they made stadium a measure of distance. So, so he had guys walk and run, 300 stadia, something like that, more than that. And they confirmed that at a given moment, no shadow there. Then he measured this. It turned out to be 7 degrees. And so he said, now, if the earth is round, I can go around this way. And if I know how big a distance this is, and every 7 degrees is the same number of miles, a stadia, I will know the circumference of the earth. Work.
Yeah.
300 BC.
Wow.
His measurements were between 24,500 and 29,000 miles, and the correct is about 24,800. And that's with a stick and a shadow. That's pretty good. Most accurate until the 16th century. Then there was another one, the same name but no relation. Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria at the turn of the millennium, an astrologer and an astronomer and a mathematician. He took the work of Eratosthenes and he said, well, I think he's off. And so he started his measures of the earth. And he wrote a book called the Amalgast, in which he saw this is the way the solar system was created. We're still a long way from Galileo, yeah, and we're in the middle there. But he created these like glass bowls. And from that, he did do the math to predict the positions of the stars and planets that you would see in the night. His work was dominant in the world until Copernicus had other ideas in 1543. But he determined that it was all going to be affected by where the stars were as astrology. What Shakespeare line, our fault, your bruise lies not in the stars, but in ourselves. So he made this map. Christopher Columbus carried this map 1,000 years later. You see that he had to select the continents, and he did do one thing, which was to create longitude lines so you could grid it on. The problem with him is that for a mathematician, he made some errors because he used travelers' reports, and using that and his own observations, he rejected Eratosthenes. And he decided that there were only 50 miles between degrees of latitude, when the truth is it's 70. This is why Columbus thought he could make it to the Orient from Spain, because he thought the world was 1/3 smaller than it actually is. And we know how that came out. Let's go back to Cleopatra. The story apparently of her having herself wrapped in a carpet and brought in and rolled out on Caesar's floor is true. And he was just taken by her. She was Cleopatra VII. And part of the tradition of the Ptolemy family was power grabs and plots. Cleopatra VII had 3 siblings, 2 brothers and a sister. The sister she had murdered outright. The 2 brothers, she married one and then the other, married, killed, married, killed, got Caesar to help her kill the 14th, later one. And then she became Caesar's mistress and he came to control Egypt. Her affair with Caesar was an absolute scandal for the Romans. Just they just couldn't bear it. They felt a little better when decades later she married Mark Antony. I'll come back to that in a moment. Is that Elizabeth Hill? She had a son with Caesar, Caesarea. That's the only son that Caesar ever acknowledged. Caesar was married, he had 2 daughters legally, legitimately, but he never had a son until this liaison with Cleopatra VII. Caesarion was going to be entitled to inherit the throne, but the Romans got in the way of that again. She had that child with Caesar, and then she had 3 children with Mark Antony. A set of twins, fraternal twins, a boy and a girl, and then they had another boy. They were Cleopatra Selene, Alexander Helios, and then 4 years later, Ptolemy Philadelphus. They will not have a good end, because when Caesar falls, and she was in Rome when Caesar was assassinated, she gathered up the kids and she got out of there as quickly as possible back to Egypt. Well, we'll come back to that in a moment. I'm not ready to kill her yet. Cleopatra Selene and Alexander Helios were just, and Ptolemy here were just children. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, conquered the empire and defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 30 BC. These children, you can see, were 10 and 6. And so she didn't know what to do. She and Mark Antony went off, and basically they killed themselves. So here are these kids now orphans. Mark Antony was a sleaze, and he had these children with Cleopatra and then just abandoned it. So the woman he had been married to in Rome thought, you're a son of a bitch, but these children are innocent. And so she sent for and took Cleopatra's children and raised them herself. I mean, it's a wonderful, heartwarming story. Cleopatra Selene later became the queen of a country that doesn't exist anymore. Helios died of some disease in Rome. Ptolemy was killed, and the son that Caesar had with Cleopatra, Caesarion, Augustus had him hunted down and killed. When Augustus came and conquered Alexandria, Mark Antony and Cleopatra knew the game was up, so they killed themselves. Mark Antony threw himself on his sword. That is something I cannot envision doing. And she died of poison. The legend is that she got an asp, a viper, to bite her. Research is somewhat saying that it's more likely that she had poison in her hairdressing and she just took it. She didn't like snakes either. So there we have Cleopatra, who's on a better day. I'll tell you more about. She was absolutely fascinating person. Well, Cheryl and I went a few years ago, and maybe some of you were there. We went to the LA County Museum Exposition Park, and they had a display on Cleopatra, and actually had a document she had signed. And it was just fascinating. And I kept looking for the translation, and it just made me laugh out loud. Here's all these orders about who's going to be taxed and who's not going to be, and all of this. You get down to the bottom, and there's this little phrase, and then her signature. And the little phrase translates to "make it so." Captain Picard in Alexandria.
Oh,
Now, the other very famous Roman is, of course, Nero, Tiberius Nero, who was emperor into the AD period, the present period. He probably didn't look that good either, but he is charged with burning Rome and playing the fiddling while Rome burned. It was a horrendous fire. 70% of Rome was destroyed. I mean, it was awful. And the story is that he is there fiddling away. There's two problems with that. One is, this is not a fiddle, and the fiddle won't be invented for another 1,000 years. And they ought to put it on.
Looking at the pictures of all the buildings, it look like they're all adobe. How do they burn?
No, most of Rome was wood.
Oh,
You know, they were wonderful woodworkers. Augustus said that he changed Rome, and he did, which is that, and Augustus is a couple hundred years before this. Augustus said, I found a city of wood and mud, and I left it a city of marble. So if you go to Rome today, you're looking at things that Augustus and his successors did. So he was not fiddling. And more than that, he was not in Rome. He was down on the coast for the town that became known as Anzio, which was famous in World War II. But there's no question that Nero was a horrible, horrible person. He had a Praetorian Guard he really liked, and he wanted to do more than like him. So he had him castrated and made his mistress. When Christianity began to flourish, he went after it, largely because they didn't want to pay taxes. But he just didn't like the whole notion. He was God. We're not having another. So he wanted to have festivities in the Colosseum at night. And of course, there's no electricity, nothing like that. So what happens is he takes Christian and he bundles them in inflammable tar-soaked robes, hangs them on posts in the arena, and sets them on fire. And it illuminated the whole Colosseum. Eventually, just look around, he killed his own mother because she was trying to direct him. And that was about it for the Roman Praetorian Guard. So he got a notice, you are to commit suicide. And he, oh, no. Yes, you are to commit suicide. So he ultimately did, and said as he died, oh, what an artist the world loses in me. And died. Good riddance. Then we come to Christopher.
Then back up, Gary,
Huh?
did he order Rome to be burned?
No. He had nothing to do with it.
He had nothing.
Rome burned several times, largely because it was wooden slums.
Yeah.
Until later on, and they had large wooden buildings, 3 and 4 stories. So once that caught, it was going to be gone. Only the homes of the nobility were built of marble or granite or something like that. The rest of it just burned. The next one who's famous is, of course, Christopher Columbus. We have no idea that he looked like that. There's no painting of him from life. These were all created later. There's a myth, and it was an elementary school myth, and you already know it's been discredited, which is that people at Columbus's time thought the world was flat. Well, they didn't. They knew that Eratosthenes in 300 BC had proven it was round. But I like the picture. So Columbus set out not to prove that the world was round. He knew it was round. His problem was that he thought it was 1/3 smaller than it was because he was using Ptolemy's maps. And so he set out with the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. Except that they weren't named that.
Oh,
Except
All ships had nicknames and come on, get the names down here. Can you do it? I've got the ship names on there.
You go back or the same slide.
There we go. The sailors loved the whorehouses in Palos, Spain, which is where Columbus sailed from on August 3rd, 1492. And so the boat that was going to be La Nina had been nicknamed the Girl.
is that Spanish for girl anyway?
Yes.
Yeah, no, this carried an additional meaning. The Pinta, the painted one, you can see where that's going. And the Santa Maria was called the Santa Maria, but it had just been rechristened a while before. So it wasn't what Columbus thought it was going to be. He didn't like the Santa Maria in December. Shortly after he arrived in the Caribbean, he ran it aground and burned it, and then went back to Spain claiming more. He claims everything for the King of Spain and expects that he will be properly rewarded for it. He demands the title Admiral of the Ocean Sea and a minimum of 10% of whatever wealth he finds, plus slaves. We take the native peoples back. We're about out of time, so we'll do a couple of real quick ones. Yeah, there.
Why couldn't people discern that the earth was round by observing an eclipse of the moon?
I don't know that.
I mean, it's very obvious. It's very obvious what it is.
If you believe that it is a natural phenomenon, if you believe it is God casting a shadow over something or something in the universe because of divine direction of some kind. It seems to me, and I'm sure Aristophanes, 300 BC, knew that it was round. He proved the earth was round. And then the other selected bodies.
One more quick comment. I'm a history buff. I took 3 years of Latin because I wanted to get the thesis called wars. And which we read in Latin, but a lot of history there that I loved in high school. That's it. Go ahead.
Fabled figure, our first president, George Washington. He is an interesting guy, 6'2", very, very strong, had worked as a lumberman in his youth and as a blacksmith in his youth. And there was a legend, you want to be careful shaking hands with him. There was a legend that he could take a walnut and break it between his index finger and his thumb. It's unlikely, but he spread the story because it made people pretty respectful when he reached out. There are great stories about him. And you know the one about, I chopped down my father's cherry tree and I cannot tell a lie. So he told his father that he had chopped down the tree. The irony of this is, of course, it's simply not true. But Parson Weems, a minister at the time who was just intent upon teaching moral lessons to children, made up this story about Washington and the tree to show the value of honesty. The irony of it never occurred to him, and he made him a huge lie to encourage honesty. Then there's a story about Washington's teeth. This is his dentist. This is the man who made his dentures, John Greenwood. And this is a set of Washington's dentures. You will notice they are not made from wood. He never had any wood at all. Whoa, I went too far.
His were made of animal teeth, cattle, sheep, something like that. He did have hinges anchored to the one tooth he had remaining so that they would work. But he never had wooden teeth. When you see a portrait of him, you see he looks kind of puffed here. And it's because he's clamping down to keep his teeth in. And so he spoke very little. Consequently, when he did speak, people paid attention.
So is the yellow stuff?
It's the yellow is bone. It's under the animals too. If you scrape off the enamel, that's what you get. Was Napoleon short? No. He was actually the part of the reason he's thought to be short was that the people who wrote that he was short used English measurements, and the people who lived and worked with him used French measurements, and so he wasn't as short as he appeared to be in English.
There's one of those guys with big tall hats also.
Oh, yeah, that sort of takes it up. He did get platforms, though. He did want, but Augustus Caesar wore platform shoes, so he looked bigger to the Roman populace. He was not, you see, he's of a size here. And this rumors went about him being short, so most often he would appear on horseback. So it didn't really matter. But in the palace and such, he was there in person. The fun thing about this is that there's so many short people who you don't think of as being short. Churchill's like 5'7", Stalin's 5'6" or 7. Groucho Marx is about 5'7". Henry Winkler, you know, is pretty short. Baryshnikov and Cole Porter. So he was part of a prestigious group of being short. And then we'll finish with this one, who is not short. This is William Howard Taft. He was vice president under Theodore Roosevelt. Before that, he was the governor of the Philippines after the United States annexed them at the end of the Spanish-American War. He was an absolutely brilliant man. But he weighed 350 pounds. There was a Will Rogers of the 1900s, Mr. Dooley, who wrote a little doggerel thing once in the newspaper that a formidable man, both fore and aft, is he who's known as Mr. Taft. Well,
My hometown would think that.
yes, a lot of places are worthwhile. This is the great distinction with him. He was the 27th president of the United States. He followed Theodore Roosevelt. After he finished his presidential term, he was appointed to be the Chief Justice on the United States Supreme Court. He is the only person in our history who has been Chief Justice and President of the United States. That is truly, truly an accomplishment. But you can see, and the story his political enemies started writing was that he, Archimedes' principle and all, he went to take a bath, he got in, pushed the water out, suction held him, he got stuck in the White House bathtub, and he couldn't get out. And it caused an uproar while they got 4 guys to come cut the tub apart so he could get out. It's not true. Actually,
Oh my God.
actually, Taft knew how big he was, and before he moved into the White House, he had this tub installed. And here are 4 of the men who installed it. Now, if that can hold 4 men, it's not going to trap Taft. I think it's just fun. He was throwing out the first ball in the 1910 baseball season. He was, wait a minute, before we leave him, I want to go back. I'm sorry, I'm so off the mark here. The bathtub story didn't happen in the White House, but after he was out of office, he stayed overnight in a hotel in Washington. And there was a small tub for him. And he sank in and the water went out and he did get stuck. But the water then seeped through the floor and flooded the hotel room, the people downstairs. He never could quite live that down. I think this one's fun, and then we actually will finish. There's a myth that Albert Einstein failed math when he was in school. No, as a child. It's absolutely not true. There he is as a young man. What he did fail was the entrance exam for the Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich. Because the test was in French. And numbers, no sweat, but word problems, you can't do it. So what he failed was the entrance exam for the school, not the math. But it's a fun story. He was controversial enough that J. Edgar Hoover took an interest in him, and the FBI kept a file on him for 40 years. Wow. I don't know what they expected he was going to do. When he died, a doctor talked people into giving Thomas Harvey, a doctor, talked the government into giving him Einstein's brain. And he took it to make all kinds of studies on it. Are the convolutions the same as yours? Coloring, the nutrient, whatever. I don't know the answer to that, but there was such concern that he was so special, so different, that it was worth taking his brain out of his head and studying it. This guy drove all the way across country with Einstein's brain in a jar in a car. I mean, it's just more fun. Oh, Mussolini, we gotta go.
Yeah,
Spoiler, Mussolini did not make the trains run on fire.
Just a quick announcement, I mentioned before, Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, which is nearby, and that we have kind of done some things with them, Pastor Spitter's been in touch with them. They're going to be having a Black History Month event next Sunday night at 6:30. It's going to be a video recording of the James Baldwin William Buckley debate that took place in Cambridge in 1965. Followed by a discussion. So I hope if you're available to come, I think I'm gonna try and make it.
You haven't, will be announcement?
I'm sorry.
I don't need.
I didn't have an announcement. I mean, I don't even think you were.
Well, I don't know. Pastor Mike set it up, so I don't, but I'm not, I'm announcing it here. He said it to me to announce the ADG. That's what I'm doing.